We have arrived on a new world, so naturally your first reaction is to smash everything. Here's how you do it. This game is all about two-weapon synergy. Whilst it's possible to combine anything, a good combination is about having defined weapon roles, shared stat scaling, and complementary damage types. On the face of it, there are 11 weapons to choose from, dealing 6 different types of damage against 5 different mob types. You would be forgiven for assuming that zones are evenly spread to balance that out, but Lost and Ancient make up at least 75% of everything you kill over the majority of leveling. And, of the 11, there is only strike damage on the Warhammer that gains bonuses against both. A weapon with very high base damage that scales fully with strength, a stat containing all the melee damage buffs. The other weapon fully scaling with strength is the Great Axe, which in turn covers Hammer's weakness by bringing stronger AoE abilities, and uses slash damage that has a bonus against Angry Earth. If I was then to say that of the 6 initial dungeons, 4 contain zombies, skeletons and dryads, you can guess where we're going. That's not to completely discredit dexterity weapons. A lot of the stuff happening out in the world revolves around Corrupted. Shattered Mountain, invasions, anchors, that type of thing. You just won't be seeing it for a while, and of course in PvP, everything is equal. Also, it's worth noting, weapon skill gains basically match the experience of what you're killing, so naturally, the higher that is, the faster a new weapon grows. Personally, I'll be skilling pretty much everything, but it's obvious where we start the journey. So I'll be explaining the finer points of pairing the hammer with the axe. But first a caveat: whatever weapon you use in the end, if you struggle to survive, drop one and take a life staff. You don't do DPS when you're dead, and the best pocket healer in this game is yourself. So let's start looking at stuff. First off, my choices will always be maximizing damage. I'm also not going to be reading tooltips at you, as they are mostly incremental changes. That's just a waste of time. But we do need to know what stuff does, so I have instead made a key so that we can see everything together. The blue or red borders indicate duration and target. Using this, we can assess the general intentions behind both trees. The majority of damage and grit is on the left, mitigation, mobility and self-healing is on the right. A brief introduction of the abilities if you don't know. We have Armor Break, a generic hammer to the face, Mighty Gavel, a harder hammer to the face, Wrecking Ball, a slap through the floor, then Shockwave, a low damage AoE stun, Clear Out, an AoE knockback, and Path of Destiny, some light AoE. The conclusion is that this weapon is about single target damage and area control. There is one kink in this whole situation, aside from all the flagellation, in that the useful passives on the right only work against debuffed targets. For the move speed and cooldown reduction, the debuff just has to be there, but in the case of the damage increase, the debuff must come from the Warhammer. This is a problem, because whilst the T6 Crusher gives a debuff, it's short and only from Crusher abilities. It also stops us using Mighty Gavel, an unacceptable loss. There are only 2 10-second debuffs, a single target rend on the left, and an AoE weakness on the right. But really, it's not the size of the AoE, it's how you use it. Most abilities aren't target locked, and you are in effect waving a small rectangle. And whilst the players have collision, mobs do not. Stack the mobs on top of each other, and rend hits everything. But even if we couldn't spread it about, rend still beats weakness. So that's pick 1. As for the other passives it has, Grit is good, and the damage to full health targets will almost never happen, so we can drop it. The next most obvious choice is Mighty Gavel. It first gains an execute, then a couple of wasted points, but given that it's tied into the T6 passive, you can't skip them or Gavel, so 2 of the 3 abilities are in effect chosen for us. The third choice is actually a little awkward. The de facto answer is Wrecking Ball, as we have already unlocked that part of the tree. It's a short cooldown crowd control, but it's basically the weaker version of Clear Out, which is faster, includes grit, hits a wider area, and both knocks back and down. In the open world, that's your obvious third choice. However, please do think before bringing Clear Out to a dungeon. Nobody enjoys having mobs constantly punted out of their AoE, and MMO players are generally so well known for their patience and kindness. On the other hand, if you are capable of knocking stray mobs back into the pack, or defending the backline from strays, then by all means take it, but choose wisely, otherwise this will inspire nothing but nerd rage. As for Path of Destiny, it's good for AoE farming skeletons, but it's generally overlooked for this. Mostly because to get there we have to sacrifice points we don't have, and we are giving up utility for some mild AoE. You might as well take Shockwave to keep the utility and mass weakness. Right, now that we have our 3 abilities, it's down to general passives. We need to make up 10 points on the left for Gavel, but thankfully there are no other dead points. We only want damage, so filtering out the mitigation and crusher only stuff, we are left with a rather small selection, and a rather awkward gap starting the crusher tree. This isn't a problem when using clear out, as that means you can use this lost point to make it heal you. So filling in the rest, we get this. Armor Break has its damage at full health removed, as said before, and we have no spare points to just throw one away on it. In general terms, you will be using Heavy Attack to maintain Empower, Armor Break to apply Rend, then Mighty Gavel to smash it in the face, and just Wrecking Ball whenever. There are 2 points of leeway in this whole thing, and it's the almost constant haste buff and the damage on damage taken passive. I find their usages are higher where they are, but if you want to have a slightly wider slap, you're going to have to lose both. Because we don't have anything to start Crusher, the AoE Fortify is better because reduced stamina on block is pointless. Before moving on, the last thing to talk about is the Amrine Expedition. This is forced group content, and will likely be the first time for many players. And whilst the build I've been talking about uses all the points, you probably won't have tier 6 by the time you get sent there. So I made a 10-point build, focusing on what's important. Apart from putting Rend on as many things as you can, there's no other thinking, just heavier way to victory. On a side note, if you want to use Clear Out instead, then it also lets you get hold of the damage passive, and it looks like this. This is also the basic spec for world leveling. Of course, once you get the 12, you turn on Gavel's T6 before rebuilding the points in the Crusher tree. If you want to go AoE farming, grab the heal and swap out Gavel for Path. Great, all done. Moving on to the Endless Cleave Machine. We're going to repeat the same format, Y-Breaker winning formula. The trees are set up the same, single target on the left, AoE on the right. We can see that there is a good chunk of damage evenly spread, but all the self-healing is on the left, mitigation on the right. There is very little in the way of mobility until you get to the T6 on Reaper, but there's lots of pulling things. The abilities on the axe all have cooldowns around the 20 to 30 second range, so try not to waste them. In summary, we start with Charge, a gap closer and the best way to cross rivers, Reap, a grip for when you missed with Charge, and an Execute called Execute. Whirlwind, the fastest way to fail at AoE, Maelstrom, better than Whirlwind, and lastly Gravity Well, probably broken, and a great way to publicly embarrass yourself. What you'll notice on the Reaper tree is that it has a way to start, maintain, and end a fight, but the Mauler tree has all the general usage. First to arrive is Maelstrom, standard AoE. It has a pull mechanic on it, but you only pull stuff you've already hit, so you're not a vortex of destruction. It comes with a second swing after some dubious points, but it's a pretty staple choice for many different roles. Second, Whirlwind is a pain in the ass. It has a long 30-second cooldown, requires consecutive hits to keep spinning, all whilst managing to be interrupted by the smallest incoming damage. And for this reason it has no practical value solo, and requires a tank that can hold threat. I'm going to assume you have one, but if your tank is bad, consider taking Reap instead. Odds on stuff is just running about all over the place. The passives give it the hope of more spins, move speed, and more damage. Third, Gravity Well is a large sphere that is supposed to slow and pull things to its centre, with the damage arriving at the end. Nobody knows what it will actually be doing, but we're going to assume that this is what's happening. It's very popular in PvP, as it's also one of the few abilities with a passive that scales on the quantity of targets hit. The centre of the sphere is placed 8 meters from you, but it has collision so it should stop. You can always throw it into the floor if you can't aim. Otherwise, you will be creating a brightly glowing orb of disillusionment off to the side. Right, so we're going to keep these 3 from Mauler and look at the general passives. As you can see, the Mauler tree doesn't have much in the way of DPS. It does have the Grit and Fortify perk though, and more damage on AoE, but nothing else inspiring for our purposes, as we don't need the pull duration. The Reaper tree has a very important perk in the first row that buffs all damage on light attacks. This will be in everything you make. The self-healing is based on crits and then low mob health. Try and pick them up if you can. So throwing away the stuff we don't need for this build, we get a good selection really. Not many cut out, few situational ones on the right, but we don't really have enough points to get them. So putting it together, we get this. There's the double swing on Maelstrom and the upgrades to Whirlwind and Gravity Well. For the rest, on the left we've got the buff on light attack, heal on crit, and some general damage perks. We also have the all-important Grit and Fortify on heavy, bonus damage when AoEing, all of course leading into the tier 6 damage buff on hit. This is the most AoE DPS you can get hold of, but there's nothing complex with gameplay. It just requires uptime for buff maintenance. As long as you're constantly hitting stuff, you're good to go. The nice thing about the axe is that it's very versatile. As I mentioned earlier, we can change this build into more general usage by simply swapping Whirlwind for Reap, which, as well as being able to grip strays, comes with a heal and an AoE. It's just a great thing with no dead weight. And because we have 6 points in Reaper Tree already, by adding these 4 we can also change the T6 to the much more user-friendly buff. Of course, this does less damage on paper, but that's only true in practice if mobs are stacked up neatly and you aren't getting punched out of Whirlwind the moment you use it. There is a strong probability that this is the first build you'll be working towards. So, like the hammer, here is the 10-point Amrine build. It's still the core stuff, same AoE abilities, light attack buff, grit on heavy, general damage on AoE, but given we only have a couple of general passives, there's a fair amount of leeway in this one for abilities. If you irrationally hate Maelstrom, take out its 3 points, put one in Gravity Well to link to the AoE perk, and the last 2 in Whirlwind. But much more likely is the setup we just mentioned, where we drop the points in Whirlwind and put them in Reap. Lastly, I'm going to detour briefly into more general terms, because we haven't talked about Charge and Execute. It should be fairly evident by this point that your PvP build would be Charge, Reap, and Gravity Well. But that's not what we're doing here, and Charge in World PvE is a crap travel ability at best. A convenient way to cross water and occasionally move slightly faster, and it brings no value to dungeons. Initially, I assumed I must take it. It's such an obvious choice for leveling, right? Using an AoE weapon to charge at one target over and over is probably the most common thing you'll see in game. But the respawns are fast, aggro range is large, and you can grip things almost the same distance as you can charge. If you're worried about tagging stuff, do the job properly and bring a ranged weapon. But fine, if you're someone who feels socially pressured into using Charge in PvE, then drop Gravity Well and put the other point in healing. As for Execute, it does great damage, but not to the exclusion of just hitting it with something else when you get to that health level. Unless you're fighting elites. With large health pools, there's a fair amount of overkill. But game time is all about efficiency. If you're only fighting 1 or 2 things at a time, Gravity Well is not providing you value, and the AoE passive just straight up isn't working. So take those out and put 3 into Execute. And there you have, well, the general Reaper build. And that's me done. Hope you found it helpful, and if you think this video is worth helping other people, then do the usual things. Like, comment, and of course subscribe. And if you want to have a chat, you can always find me on Twitch. Cheers then, and good luck in New World.